What is ESG? Well, that's what I'm talking about this week. Stay tuned. So what the heck is ESG? ESG is a way to invest based on a certain set of criteria. There used to be, and there still is, a way to invest called SRI, Socially Responsible Investing. Now, this was based on the idea that when you invested, you didn't invest in companies such as big tobacco, anything related to the adult film industry, alcohol, those kinds of what they would consider sin stocks. You would not invest in those styles of stocks. So there's different funds and different companies that offer these funds that allow you to invest in companies that don't do that. This way, you're not feeling the moral guilt of investing in those types of companies. So ESG is the new version of this, and ESG is based on some new set of criteria. So the criteria for ESG I found seems to be most commonly this. First of all, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So it breaks out in those three different criteria, and among those three criteria, it breaks out even further. So you'll see it's environmental, which can include carbon emissions, air and water pollution, deforestation, waste management, water usage. Social, which includes employee gender and diversity, data security, customer satisfaction, human rights, fair labor policies. And then governance, diversity of board members, political contributions, executive pay, large-scale lawsuit, internal corruption, lobbying. Now, those are the criteria for ESG investing. However, the hardest part and the biggest downside to ESG investing is that there is no one particular standard. So although a lot of rating companies have come out to try and develop their own rating standards, for example, Morningstar, some of the tools that we use on the analysis side came out with its own particular tool around ESG and how to rate these different companies and funds. There is no one particular standard in terms of how to rate. So it's not so cut and dry as this company gets a 10 for environmental, but only a 6 for social, and so on and so forth. The hard part is that ESG has now become a very common marketing piece, meaning companies and fund managers, the ones who manage some of these investments, have essentially come out and just thrown the term around very loosely in order to gain new revenue, gain new investment dollars, and has turned almost into a marketing ploy. And I'll give you some evidence of that. So this article came out in the Harvard Business Review in March of this year, talking about the inconvenient truth about ESG investing. Now, firstly, before I dive into that, so one of the big factors that they were talking about, at least as it relates to ESG investing, is in most cases, companies are already starting to think about all of these things before ESG became a thing. And part of that is what this researcher found, which was that very same idea, saying that in a competitive labor market and product market, corporate managers are trying to maximize value on their own accord, paying attention to employee, customer, community, environmental interests. And so it's actually just coming out and saying, hey, look, these companies are already focused on these things, irregardless of what ESG has come out and said. Now, one of the most interesting things that came out of this particular review was the evidence that he quoted talking about that if managers were underperforming in earnings, then they would go on to start mentioning and start talking about ESG factors. So if a company is doing poorly on the earnings call, the company would say, hey, well, we're focused on ESG and that's why our earnings have, kind of deteriorated or weren't as great as we thought they were going to be. And again, he found that when you flip the script and companies were actually beating expectations, they made very few public statements relating to ESG. And so it was this interesting dichotomy that it turned out that if companies were doing poorly, they would throw, hey, ESG, 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 and they would say, well, that's because we're doing so poorly. And if they weren't doing poorly and they were doing really well, they wouldn't tout that, we've also been implementing this ESG criteria or standards so that, we can better everything on that end. So it's kind of interesting when you look at some of the framework around what ESG is built upon. Now, obviously, there's lots of different articles, there's different ideas around what makes ESG investing work or how that looks, how it's performed. When in reality, the bottom line is that ESG hasn't performed any better or any worse than a traditional mutual fund, ETF, or for that case, stock. And this was some of the issue that I have with ESG is when you unpack, for example, a mutual fund that claims they're an ESG fund, within that specific fund, they're still holding most of the big names that you would hold in a traditional mutual fund anyway. They're holding names like Apple, Microsoft, Google, right? A lot of the tech companies and some of the non-tech companies, but it's basically another version of an S&P 500, which is just top 500 US company stocks that are listed on the exchange. So it didn't look like when you actually boiled down the ESG and what it means and how it operates, and underneath all of that, it's almost just a repackaged investment. ESG has already more than doubled what it was back in 2014. I'm not saying that ESG is a horrible way to invest or that what ESG stands for is terrible. What I'm trying to say is that be careful of the marketing around ESG, and you have to really dive into the details of how do they rate these companies and what is their specific criteria for doing so. Because each of these companies that are going out again and rating these companies has different levels of criteria. So there you have it, a quick overview of what the heck ESG is. It's a new way of investing that aligns with your values so that it's married up with the companies that you are investing in. It seems like there's not a particular standard or criteria, and we're not there yet to creating that standard. So all these different ratings can kind of be all over the place, and who knows what you're going to get when you're looking at the different ratings. However, what do you think about ESG? Would that be something you'd be interested in investing in? Would that be something that you're actually just interested in general? And if so, let us know. We'd love to get your feedback on that as we kind of explore out all the different options that we have to be able to invest those dollars. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, let us know. Have a great rest of your day, and of course, have a great weekend. Take care.